The following episode contains explicit content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Silence and shame, I think, are two of the driving factors. One of the phrases I'll use, I say, I believe that one of Satan's master strategies is to infect everyone with the same disease and then somehow convince them that their version of it makes them uniquely bad.
I was made to walk in the valley. I was built to stand in the storm. There's a beast deep inside me that can outlast any war. I have faced the dark and the danger. They can't scare me anymore. 'Cause I was made to walk in the valley. I was built to stand in the storm.
This is the Nook Podcast. My name is Stephen, and this is week 3 of Dirty Little Secret, looking at the effects of pornography in marriage. In the first 2 episodes, you met Mike and Aaron, a couple walking out the healing process after Mike admitted a long-standing addiction to pornography. You just heard a short clip from Nick Stumbo. He's the executive director of Pure Desire, a ministry focused on providing a safe place where people can find hope and healing from the effects of sexual brokenness. For this third installment, I hope to illuminate some of the deeper issues going on in the addict. There is the obvious side, the physiology. Then there is the spiritual element. I don't think it's a stretch to call the issue a form of adultery, in that the addict is increasingly looking for sexual fulfillment outside of marriage. And then there's the psychological piece. So much is happening in the mentality of a porn addict that doesn't just shut off after he or she has admitted the issue. I invited Nick to talk about all of this because I feel it's so important to understand the holistic approach needed to help people struggling with unhealthy sexual behaviors, and the spouses who are often left devastated and not sure where to turn with the unexpected discovery of betrayal. This is Dirty Little Secret, Part 3, The Mentality. Well, as you know, we are in the middle of a series talking about, I don't know if danger is the right word, the issue of pornography today, and just the damage that it's doing to people, the damage that it's doing to marriages. And quite frankly, I just feel like this is a conversation that needs to be replicated, that it needs to be happening so much more in the church, and not just from a you shouldn't do that kind of an aspect. And that's why I really, everything that I've read about your organization, it just seems like, okay, here's what we need. We need answers. We need a solution. And from all the material that I've seen that you guys have available, the other speakers that you have on staff, it just seems like this is a very focused place with a very focused mission. Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I agree. I feel like when Dr. Ted Roberts started Pure Desire, it was really begun as a ministry in his local church because he was counseling lots of men and lots of couples, and he realized I can talk to them about finances and in-laws and communication all day, but under the surface, if there's unresolved sexual brokenness, sexual addiction, whether it's pornography or clubs or, everything that can exist in our world, he just realized I'm not really helping people. We have to get someone free at that very deep personal level, because then all that other stuff we can actually navigate. And so, we just have identified this is an area that not enough people are equipped in. And honestly, in my opinion, not nearly enough people are here to help. It's a growing area. I'm thankful for that, but we really are laser focused to say we're not just here to give general relationship or marriage advice, but really to hone in on that area of our sexuality and the way that addiction can develop there, and understand a pathway to freedom that is much more than just trying harder, praying more, read our Bible more, don't do it, snap the rubber band, some of those behavioral type tactics. And all those things are good. I mean, we should read our Bibles, we should pray, But there's an understanding that there's a lot more going on in our sexuality, especially if we've been trapped in a behavior for a while, that freedom is a much more robust process than most people expect.
Yeah.
But that's what we're here for. That's what we do. And really trying to train and equip churches how to do that for themselves, because we believe that at the end of the day, that's where the victory is won, is that if in a local church, a person feels safe to say, my church is a place I can go and be honest and find healing, that will change our culture. Because I think right now, most people feel they can't go to their church. They can't talk to anyone around them for the fear of being kicked out, removed, blacklisted, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And so we stay silent. We maybe go to a counselor outside the church, but that's a deep conviction we have, is that if people always have to go outside the church to find healing, but they come back to their community and don't feel safe, the lasting change is really going to be difficult. So that's a big part of our mission, is how do we help equip churches to be that safe place for people to find healing?
Yeah. Well, for context for you, Mike has shared already that this was a problem for him that started back in high school. And he had a youth pastor who would give very pointed messages about don't do that. But there was never a solution. He was actually ultimately found out by his parents because they saw the search history on a computer. Same kind of thing where he was scolded, and we didn't raise you to be that kind of a young man. So it was really so much more of a shaming, a scolding, and no answers. And I feel like it's situations like that, and like what you were just saying, with if there was more of an understanding of safety within our churches, that you wouldn't have people feeling like, well, I just need to keep this under wraps. And the more that they shove that back, the more that they isolate, I just feel like that's when the issue, the habit really sets in so hardcore that it just seems like you cannot escape it.
Yeah, it's silence and shame, I think, are two of the driving factors. One of the phrases I'll use, I say, I believe that one of Satan's master strategies is to infect everyone with the same disease and then somehow convince them that their version of it makes them uniquely bad.
Oh, wow, that's good.
And so we sit around in churches or communities and we look around, and because no one's talking about it, it's easy to assume that everybody else seems to have this figured out. Every other marriage seems to be doing fine. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with my spouse? Why can't we figure this out? And so you don't open up to those around you. And that shame of what's wrong with me is actually, the shame and isolation is part of what drives us back into the very behavior that we're trying to avoid. And I've also said in many places, the sickness and the remedy can't be the same thing. If isolation and shame are the sickness, which I believe they are, that on our own we're battling this voice of there's something wrong with me, I'm unworthy, I'm dirty, I'm defiled, I've wasted my opportunity with God and others because of these choices I've made. And then our solution that we often offer is, well, by yourself, try harder, to prove that you're not worthless or you're not shameful. And we just stay stuck, because if shame and isolation are the sickness, then the remedy truly is openness, vulnerability, and community. And that's very, very hard to find, I think, in the local context for many people. And so that's why it's our mission to help churches start groups, to equip leaders, and to train people how to be a part of this healing process. One of the stats that drives us is the Barna Institute put out a research document several years ago commissioned by Josh McDowell Ministries. And they found that only 7% of the churches they interviewed had a plan, a specific plan or group or ministry to help people who are battling with pornography.
Wow.
And so that means in 93% of churches, the vast majority of them, there's not really a plan. There's not a group. There's not a ministry. There's a hope that people are doing well. There might be a counselor they direct people to, but there's not a plan. And I think in the absence of that clear, communicated plan, people assume, well, this isn't safe to bring up here.
Yeah.
And so one of the passions I have that drives me is, how do we move that number from 7%? Because my conviction is that every church should have something.
Yeah.
And where we ever hit 100%, well, that may be unlikely. But the thought, if if 68% of men in the church, and this is what our research at Pure Desire has found consistently, is that if 68% of men in the church and 25 to 30% of women are battling with some kind of unresolved sexual behavior in their life, and that could be on the whole spectrum, but they are saying, yes, there's something in my life. I don't want it there. I don't think it's done. I don't think it's resolved. If that's the number in the church, then what percentage of churches do need something? And that's where you say, man, 100%.
Yeah.
I've used the illustration too, that if a research company came into your church, you paid them to say, we really feel like we're struggling to do discipleship well. We feel like something is holding our people back. And if they had the ability, this outside research company, to interview every single person in your church, find out their full family history, everything going on, what if they came back to the pastor or the leadership team of the church and said, we've interviewed every single person and we have found out that 68% of your men and 25% of your women are on cocaine once a month. That once a month they're at home shooting up on cocaine. We think that's what's holding back your discipleship process. Now, if any pastor or church in the world heard that stat, what would be your plan of action? Well, your first plan would be like, we've got to help people get off cocaine.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter what else we do. If they're battling with cocaine, it doesn't matter what else we do. So there would be that urgency. But when we hear the number about pornography, it's like, but we preach the gospel here. We really, we train people to be in the Word and in prayer. It's like, well, that's awesome. But the same chemical process in the brain that makes someone addicted to cocaine is also happening in our sexual struggles at the same level of intensity. Now, cocaine is more mind-altering. Cocaine is obviously illegal. Cocaine, culturally, there's more of a stigma perhaps around it. So there are differences. But at a brain neurological chemical level, the intensity of the dopamine and the adrenaline, the neurochemicals being released, are as powerful in a sexual battle or a sexual addiction as they are in cocaine. And yet our response as a church is to say, well, we don't know if it's that big of a deal. And I look at it and say, I don't know how we can remove ourselves from a need to do something about it if that's the truth of what's going on.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up stats, because that's one thing that I wanted to look at, because much like we've heard for years, it seems, maybe even decades, that sadly the divorce rate in churches pretty much mimics divorce rate outside of churches. And that's a brutal statement all by itself. But if you're saying that 68% of men are dealing with this, is that a low side number just based on the same shame idea? Is everybody going to answer the survey or whatever that question is that garners the 68%? How many guys just went, oh no, I don't have a problem with that?
Yeah, you're spot on. It's a very difficult subject to ask people about and get honesty, because on the one hand, they might feel like, okay, who's really going to know what I answered? Is this really confidential? So there's that skepticism. But then there's the reality that when we're stuck in this kind of behavior, it's very, very common that there's a high level of rationalizing our behavior, minimizing our behavior, or even denying that we really have a problem. And so just like maybe a drug addiction, many Christian men and women are trapped in a binge purge cycle that, I had a bad weekend, or I had a bad night, I relapsed, I was up on the computer, it was really bad, but that was 3 weeks ago. So, if they've gotten beyond their binge and they're in the purge of, I confessed it, I told God how sorry I am, I promised it's the last time. And then if someone came along and asked the question, hey, do you struggle with pornography? Well, if I'm in my purge and it's been a couple of weeks, like, well, no, last time was the last time.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe this has been the pattern in my life for 10, 15, 20 years, but do you struggle with pornography? Well, not anymore, because I'm doing good right now.
Oh, yeah.
And so it can be difficult to get real upfront, honest answers. And that's what I've said to many leaders. I've said, what if these statistics were even half true? What if they were even half accurate? What if a third of your men said, I am stuck in unwanted sexual behavior and pornography, an addiction to pornography? I think if even a third of our men and a sixth or a seventh of our women, we would still say this is a major issue. And seriously? I can tell you, I'm 100% confident they're at least half true. And I'm 99.9% confident that, as you said, they're accurate or even underreported based on how people would respond to the questions.
Right. So is the answer in that what you've already stated in empowering churches to be more bold in addressing it? Or, maybe obviously I think you have to have a good back end already built into that there's got to be a good, you can't just get up and say, there is a problem. I've been very disillusioned with the word awareness because I feel like everybody wants to talk about awareness, but then there's not really any plan of action after that. Is your ultimate goal to see more churches empowered to have a good catch system and embolden them to speak right to it, to say, not in my house kind of a thing?
Yeah, I think when we talk about openness, there's two sides to that. There's the openness in truth and openness in grace. And I think some churches maybe think, like we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, man, we just really need to focus on, we talk about it more, and we talk about how bad it is and how wrong it is and how destructive it is and how evil it is and what's happening in the world, because it leads to abuse and rape. And we just need to, pound the pulpit on how bad it is. And all that is very, very true. But what I would say in working with thousands of men at this point, I have never, and I sincerely mean that, I'm not exaggerating, I've never had a man or a woman say to me, I just didn't know how bad this was. I just didn't know this was wrong. I didn't know this could be a problem. Now, I'm confident that perhaps outside the church, in a culture that has normalized pornography and that sort of thing, that there are people that may be trapped in that mindset. Oh, what's the big deal? It's not wrong.
Yeah.
But the people that come for help, they know it's wrong. They know it's destructive. They don't know what to do about it. And if our idea of openness is just talking about the evils more, we may actually drive people further into hiding because they feel like, and I'm the one doing it. What's wrong with me? So openness, I think, has to really be focused on grace. There has to be a message of, we are, one of the things I talk about is we need to start not in Genesis 3 with the fall of man. We need to start in Genesis 1 with the creation of man and women.
Wow.
But in Genesis 1, it says God created them in his image. And do you know, when we first hear God say that we were made in his image is also, and in my opinion, not coincidentally at all, that's also where we first hear God distinguishing male and female.
Right. So
it's in his image, male and female, he created them, which indicates to me there is something about my gender, which is uniquely, gender, if we're honest, is uniquely sexual.
Yeah.
Body parts, brain chemistry, hormones, development. Yes, there are distinctions in other physical parts, but primarily it's a sexual distinction to be male and female. And when God did that, he looked at that and said, that's my image.
Right.
There's something about the maleness of our sexuality, the femaleness of our sexuality that God says, that actually bears my image and it's good. And now I bring you together and I say, go out, be fruitful and multiply. Essentially, God's saying, enjoy the sexual differences that bring you together and create unity. And then we end in Genesis 2, this beautiful picture that the man and woman, the male and the female, both in the image of God, coming together, becoming one flesh, and saying they were naked and unashamed.
Yeah.
And I think that openness of, to be a sexual being was a beautiful God-given thing.
Right.
And then we need to recognize Genesis 3 happened, that we were all then born into sin and born into a sinful world that does mar the beauty of God's goodness. But to say to people, our churches, one of the encouragements I'll give a leader is to say, your people need to hear you say, we are all sexual beings. We are all made in the image of God as sexual beings. And then we've all experienced some kind of brokenness, some kind of sin in our sexuality, whether things done to us or things done against us. And that means we are all, every single one of us, in need of the work of Christ in our life to understand, how do I heal and grow in the area of my sexuality?
Yes.
And so when we start to use language like that if you're struggling in this area, welcome to the club. It just means you're a human being. And if your struggle has become more pronounced, there may be steps you need to take, and we're here for that. That's why, what we bring to a church is we say what we think you need is not just and so here's the other side of my answer. I realize I'm going on a bit here.
No worries.
So it's not just the openness to talk about it. That openness needs to be accompanied by a plan. Because too often what I have seen, maybe at a men's retreat, a conference, a spiritual emphasis week, that we're very open about it. We need to get real. We need to get honest. Go home and tell your spouses, which we could get into that later, may actually be more destructive than good if that's their first conversation. Tell another man, get real. And that's kind of the end of our plan.
Yeah.
That we somehow believe confession and authenticity is the goal. And what I've said, confession and authenticity isn't the goal, it's the starting point.
Yeah.
The goal is freedom. And James chapter 5 talks about that as we confess our sins one to another, we will be healed. But a thing I'll bring up about that passage is the Greek verb used there in James 5 for confession is not the one-time verb. It's the verb used for ongoing action. So it's confessing. So talking about how do we live in this attitude of openness and accountability, but then having a plan to say, how do I address this behavior that I've gotten caught up in? Because as I've talked about already, there are brain chemicals and brain pathways that many of us have been training since early teenage years, or for some, unfortunately, even earlier in childhood, if there was early exposure to pornography, or if there was abuse that came into their world that was sexual in nature at a young age, they developed sexual patterns of the chemicals and how they act maybe 20, 30, 40 years. And just because we've gotten open and maybe entered into a lifestyle of confession doesn't mean the problem will be changed unless there's a plan. And that's where we've seen having a group structure where someone can go into a community experience, not just to be honest, but to actually work on a process of healing and change is as crucial, I think, as the openness. And so would encourage people to think about the two sides, because I do think there's work to be done in our homes and in our churches on both sides. More openness with grace and vulnerability and truth, but grace too. And on the side of, well, and then what's the plan?
Right.
Because I think if you went also back to the cocaine illustration, and then I'll stop with this answer, if someone did come and say, I'm one of those, I'm once a month shooting up on cocaine, would you help me? We wouldn't just pray for them, thank them for their honesty, and send them home and say, go and do cocaine no more.
Yeah.
Right? Like we'd say, let's find you a program. Let's get you a plan where there's weekly community. There's things you're working on. There's understanding of what I need to change and do instead. And I would say the same exists if we've been battling with unwanted sexual behaviors. Yes, the prayer is good. The openness is good. Inviting God's healing work is good. And let's have a plan. Let's have a program in place that actually helps people walk out long-term healing in this area.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you just touched on that similar reaction happening to someone as you might expect with cocaine, some sort of a drug that feeling is happening for a person. Is it possible for you to kind of distill what is happening to someone? And maybe that's more of a long-range question. I'm not talking about that time that they are sitting in front of that computer and those things are happening, but what is happening over time? Someone who is just really stuck in it for a year, 5 years, 10 years. What is happening to that person that really may be outside of their understanding? It's like into that, good grief, I had no idea that it was going to be this bad where I am right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I would kind of answer that on two levels. One might be the more big picture, just character personhood side, and the other side, the more practical brain side. And I'll start there, because we've been talking about the brain chemicals and reactions. And the two words I would encourage everyone to think about and understand, and this really applies broadly to any addiction, but I think we see it specifically pronounced in sexual addiction, are the words tolerance and sensitization. Tolerance and sensitization. So tolerance means when I enter into sexual activity that isn't exclusively with a lifelong partner, there are brain chemicals that are being released that are intended to create bonding and connection with the person that I'm achieving sexual climax with. If that's not my lifelong partner, it's actually creating brain confusion and the disruption of those chemicals that the pleasure that I feel is then kind of disturbed. And what that means is over time, I will actually need a greater experience. I will need a more extreme experience to achieve the same physical high because of what's happening in the brain chemicals. And that's why typically in this kind of behavior or in any addiction, it doesn't just leave us where we are. We might say, well, what I'm doing isn't that bad. Well, just give it time.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is such a biblical truth is in James 1, how it says, your sinful desires or the evil desires in you give birth to temptation. When temptation leads us to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. That's actually happening at a neurological brain chemical level that over time we need more and more and more in order just to reach the same level of pleasure. And so there's an escalation because of that tolerance that takes place in the brain. But equally on the other side is sensitization. Because we've gotten engaged in this kind of behavior over a period of time, we're actually more alert to sexual signals. We're more easily triggered or turned on or drawn into it, because we have created this need where the brain is saying, we want that hit, we want that high. So we're more quickly excited. We're more quickly, laser focused on, well, what was that image I just saw? And now all those processes are starting my brain. And either of those two things on their own is destructive.
Yeah.
But put them together and think about the bondage or the cage that we've created, that I need more and more and more of the same thing just to get the same high. But I'm more easily turned on. I'm more easily triggered by it. So I'm just living in this place where I'm never really satisfied, but I'm always turned on.
Yeah.
I mean, that's happening at a brain level. So that's happening, over the course of time. And that's at the brain and chemical level. On more of the big picture kind of our personhood, I think what we see happening so common is just we become less and less capable of having true, meaningful connection with other human beings. Because we've begun to sexualize everything. We've begun to really have a mindset that the purpose of sexuality is my own fulfillment, my own pleasure.
Right.
So the ability, even with our spouse, to be engaged in a sexual relationship that is aimed at being mutually fulfilling, mutually satisfying, showing respect and dignity and honor for the other person, that becomes much more challenging to do because we're training ourselves that it's about me and my pleasure. And, and then even outside of our marriage, to understand other human beings for just who they are, not for their body or not how they look, becomes more challenging. And then what we've already talked about, when you're battling some of the shame or isolation and secrecy of what you're doing, your ability to just open up and enter into deep relationships is very, very limited. One of the things I put together on this that probably many listeners are familiar with is we live in a day and age where men, by and large, have fewer friendships than ever.
Yeah.
That for men to really feel deeply connected to another man, and I think this may be happening to some degree for women, but I'm not as familiar with studies or research coming out there. But I would put the two together for men, that men are deeply addicted to pornography or unwanted sexual behavior and unable to have friendships. And I think the two are connected because we don't feel safe to talk about everything. We don't open up to all the stuff going on at that heart and mind level. So connecting with another person just becomes really difficult. And I think that is an unexpected, unattended byproduct of struggling with pornography that we really need to take seriously. If we want to have deep relationships, we'll need to deal with our negative sexual history and bondage.
Yeah. Well, and you saying that just makes me think that isolation and relapse has probably just becomes a brutal cycle that a man or a woman probably feels like they just cannot break that cycle. And I feel like we could kill an hour just on this part of it. But for the sake of moving things forward, Aaron shared with me that when Mike confessed his problem, she could see a physical change in him, as truly as if a weight was off of his shoulders and the secret was out there that she could see, like okay, I'm not hiding that anymore. And while that may sound, oh, wow, Mike had a breakthrough, she just as quickly said, but all of that was then visited on her. And now she's got to try to contend with that. How do you guys handle the beginning of that healing process? Because whichever direction, whichever spouse is coming forward with that kind of a confession, we've touched on it a little bit, is just starting what is very likely going to be a long process if healing and restoration is to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. And that's, unfortunately a very, very common scenario that the spouse who's confessed, and this could go either direction. I think we see more commonly it's the man confessing to the woman, to the wife, but there's situations too. It's the wife who's having to admit to an affair or an addiction. And the same process where the one feels like, finally, I'm being honest. I'm being straightforward. I've got it off my chest. I've never felt better. Well, the other person feels like, I've never felt worse.
Right.
I've now got this weight. I've got all these questions. I feel worthless and ashamed. So the other person maybe now feels less ashamed. The other person feels more ashamed. Like, how could you do this? What's wrong with me? And that's why Pure Desire from the very beginning has been very intentional to recognize this is a family systems problem. It's not just about an addict or a struggler. And I think the traditional model is we need to send that person away, get them better, get them fixed up, bring them home, and everything will be okay. And the truth is, no, if you don't help the couple heal together, it's not going to be good for that relationship. And as you brought up, if possible, because there are certainly things that get admitted or come to light that do require, or over time, it's not possible to save the marriage. And that's a whole nother scenario we can talk about. But
Sure.
I think for many couples, they are trying to figure out, can we make this work and how? And that's why we very intentionally have groups for those who struggle and a group experience for those who are betrayed, because they're dealing with a level of trauma that doesn't just work itself out.
Yeah.
Even if the addicted or struggling spouse gets better and never struggles ever again, which is unlikely too, there's probably going to be some road bumps along the way. But even if they never ever struggle another day of their life, the betrayal and the trauma that spouse feels will likely sit until it's addressed. And that's why women who are experiencing this in their marriage really need a community of other women who are walking through this, who are understanding what the betrayal does to them, even at a brain level and to their bodies, because their brains react with needs for safety and control and a need just, how do I protect myself? And all that needs to be processed through in a safe, healing community. And so one of the things we are very, very intentional to say to churches is having a plan doesn't just mean a plan for the struggler or the addict. It means having a plan for the couple, because both are going to be deeply impacted. One of the illustrations we've used at Pure Desire is to say that, when sexual struggles come to light in a marriage, what we often do, it's like if someone was in a car accident and the person who was driving or who makes the phone call calls for an ambulance, and the ambulance comes and picks up the person who made the phone call and takes them away, while the spouse who is sitting in the seat and is hurt and has a broken leg and is bleeding, it leaves them there like, well, you figure it out on your own. We'll help this person that made the call.
Wow.
It's like, well, no, both people were in the accident and both need care. Both need a safe place. And so you can almost do more damage to that spouse if you only start a group for the man or the struggling spouse. So we're going to help all you who are struggling. All the spouses are going, well, what about me?
Right.
What do I do? Where do I go with this? One of the things that we have seen too, there's some research that was done by a secular law firm as they researched divorces that were happening in their state. And they reported that of the divorces, 56% of them involved the internet activity of one of the spouses. So I've told people, do you want to cut the divorce rate in our country in half? Get people free of internet porn, because internet porn is driving divorce. And I think it's what we're talking about right here. Not just that one person was struggling, but that it's when the struggle came to light, the other person had no resource how to deal with it. And over time, very often, if the betrayed spouse doesn't have a supportive, healing community to help them process and walk through, what does it look like to have healthy structure and boundaries, and how can I move towards trust again?
Yeah.
If that's not there for them, over time, that couple will often end up in divorce because they just don't know how to reconnect around this issue that is so deeply personal and because of that, so uniquely painful. For both the struggler and the spouse, we need to create a healing pathway. And that pathway includes being a part of a safe group, a safe community to help them process what's happening in their marriage.
You have put in 7 years, you say, with Pure Desire. I love the passion in which you present all of this. Can you tell me where that comes from in you? Why is this such a huge deal to Nick and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, the truth is that for me, everything I'm talking about, I lived it. And I feel like I lived it in a way that really underscores this can happen to anyone. My background, I grew up in a godly home. My dad was a pastor, a very solid family. I mean, my parents are great. They're married. They're on this year's their 50th wedding anniversary.
Oh,
We have a
nice.
strong relationship. There was no abuse in the home. My dad was very consistent that the person you saw at church and in the pulpit, that's who he was at home. And I mean, yeah, he wasn't perfect. He had his flaws and issues, and I've had to work through some of those in our relationship. But I had, as I've like to say, I had every advantage to grow up and not struggle with pornography. Godly parents, good church, good home. In those days, the 80s and 90s, much more able to control access to the internet and the big bad world that we didn't have, that kind of content in our home. And yet, as an 11-year-old boy, I'm at a friend's house and seeing very explicit content that his parents are watching late at night when they think we've gone to bed, but we've snuck back up the stairs and are watching from the landing some, I'm sure a rated R horror film they were watching. But to me, I mean, it might have been a porn film, because for the first time I'm seeing adult nudity and interactions on a TV screen that it's like, oh my word, I didn't even know this is real.
Yeah.
I was so sheltered from that. And because of that, I felt two very immediate things. Felt a pull towards it, a desire to see more, but at the same time, a push away of this is bad, this is wrong, I shouldn't be seeing this. And because of that push-pull, my first encounter with something sexual felt secretive and shameful.
Wow.
And I think a majority of people, that's the way sexual things come into their life. It comes before we're looking for it, before we're ready. It's secretive and it's shameful. And that led me over time into struggling with acting out with pornography and masturbation, starting out with the Sears catalog and getting more into lingerie ads. And then over time, finding where I could buy pornographic magazines. And then it's the mid-90s and you find out that pornography is on the internet and it's free. And if you have the patience to wait for the dial-up phone speed to load a picture, which actually became part of the trigger as well, just the anticipation of what will pop up and all of that, it was just deepening what I didn't know at the time really was an addiction, that I was in that binge purge cycle. And I took that into marriage. I took that into ministry. I'd heard from enough Christian men, thankfully, that I didn't ever believe marriage would fix me. They said, oh, marriage doesn't make you go away. Marriage doesn't magically make you pure or free. But I do think I believed I would just mature my way out of it, because I loved Christ. I felt called to ministry, and none of that was like a front or just this fake life I was trying to live to hide what was really going on. It was sincere. It was truly what I felt called to. And once in a while, I'd go back to that old sin and feel terrible and go through the binge purge all over. But I was in enough denial that I thought I could beat it. I would find my way out. I would just, like I said, I would mature my way out of this struggle. But we were 10 years into our marriage and into ministry, and I was still in that binge purge.
Wow.
And because I had been honest with my wife in our engagement, which I know many people don't, but there was an opportunity there where I felt encouraged, airing your dirty laundry to your future spouse. They deserve to know before they get married what they're saying I do, and that too. And that made sense to me. And so I had told her, and she had understood and asked me not to, and I had agreed. This is the last time. But I had continued to struggle. And because of our openness and engagement, I was able to come a couple of times a year probably and say, hey, I'm so sorry. It's still happening, but I'm really sorry. And I really mean it. I'm going to change. Here's why. And as you might imagine, after 10 years of that pattern, my words didn't mean anything to my wife. I remember her saying, it's not that I hate you. It's that I hate the way this makes me feel. And because I don't know if it's ever going to change, I don't know if I can stay around for this pain. And my promises that I was going to change were very, very hollow after 10 years.
Yeah.
And it was around that time, this was 2010, that we were introduced as a couple to Pure Desire, because our district of churches had developed a partnership with Pure Desire and wanted to help pastors who were struggling, particularly with internet porn and not other people or things that were illegal. They said, if it's not those things, we want to help you find freedom and not lose your job, which was a pretty phenomenal offer. And because of that, my wife and I entered into the process with Pure Desire, where she and I together went through a year of counseling with them. We both got to be in a group for husbands and for wives, separate groups. And it was so life-changing to finally face this. And for both of us to have healing resources, a healing pathway, it changed everything. I mean, to this day, 13 years later, we still refer to our marriage as before Pure Desire and after Pure Desire. And what we wanted then is nothing compared to what we have now. And walking that path, which ultimately led, after that year, I was able to share publicly with our church, with the support of my elders and district leaders who had been a part of that healing process. I was able to share about my addiction and about our journey, and open the door to healing groups in our church, which over the next 5 years, then, I tell people all the time, was far and away the most effective discipleship program we ever had.
Oh, Nick, this is so good, and I'm so glad that you were able to come and offer this insight. For the sake of time, and I would hate to ever try to portray it as something so simple as 3 points, a poem, and a prayer, but if you could, in summary, is there something you could say to that spouse that's feeling that thing that I have got to make this right, and are formulating their confession, maybe even rehearsing their confession, and encouragement for them, but also maybe some encouragement for the spouse that's about to hear something that is going to be very difficult to hear, very difficult to overcome, and probably leave a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think if you're the spouse who is struggling, my word of advice is don't go to your spouse yet. Now, you need to be 100% honest. They need to know everything. But what happens far too often is we feel the conviction and we go to our spouse and we essentially emotionally vomit all over them. Here it all is.
Yeah.
But the problem is that's not all of it, because we haven't really thought through the whole story. We haven't told them everything. And what happens is there's oh yeah, and oh yeah, and oh yeah. And so if you realize I need to tell them, you need to tell them fairly soon, but start first with another man that you can trust. Find a Pure Desire group around you. Begin to engage in the healing process. One of the things we tell spouses at Pure Desire is you need to trust their actions, not their words. So if you're the one struggling, don't think you can use your words and say, well, I promise, and it's going to be better, I promise. Use your actions to show them. Begin seeing a counselor who's trained specifically in this area of pornography and sexual addiction. Join the Pure Desire group online or at your church. Find other men that you're being accountable to every week, or maybe initially every day, and begin taking some of those steps. And if you are, what happens in marriage is there's discovery. The reason we tell our spouse is because we got caught in a piece of it. And if that's where you're at, they have a right to know what's going on, and they don't want to just wait, months or years for you to be ready.
Yeah.
So in that regard, if there is discovery or there's a need, like they know something's up, they need to know, I would really encourage you as a man to write it out, to think through, or as a woman, same thing, write out the issue, include anything that's happened in your marriage, the time you've known them, and then share that first with a friend or a group leader or a mentor to say, this is my confession to my spouse, and have them help you look through. Are you blaming anyone else? Are you minimizing? Are there pieces you're ignoring? And are there areas you're being too detailed? Because that's another mistake we make, is we start listing the names of people we're drawn to, the websites we've gone to, the body type, which is a level of detail that for most spouses is far more. I mean, it's putting the images in their brain that now they're dealing with, of like, oh my goodness. They need to know the scope of the actions and the activities, but not always every single detail. And so sharing that first written out to a friend or another person who can help you navigate, this feels like the right level, then to share that and give your spouse the dignity of where they want to know more, letting them make that choice for themselves. Now, for the spouse who maybe receives that, or maybe you've received the discovery, you've received the he confessed something, but I don't think it's everything. There can be a temptation. I'm just going to keep peppering him with questions until I feel like I know everything.
Yeah.
I really believe that for you, find that group as well, at puredesire.org or at your local church for betrayed spouses. Begin to walk with other women or other men, in that case, for those who've been down this road, who can help you understand what does it look like to create safe structure in your marriage? What does it look like maybe create a time where even you're in separate bedrooms, or in some cases, there may be the need for separate homes? All of those are just really, really big decisions. And if you can get other people who love you and love God, who help you make those decisions well, that can be so, so beneficial. But what I would want to say mostly to the betrayed spouse, that they need to hear over and over, is this is not your fault. This is not your problem. And even if an unhealthy spouse wants to blame you or put it on you to say, well, if you were only more whatever, fill in the blank. Betrayed spouse, you need to hear, that's a lie. It's not your fault. And you could be, because that's kind of the story I feel like I've lived. I had an amazing wife. If you'd known her, I mean, if you meet her now, you'd be like, yeah, Nick, you have an amazing wife. You're a lucky guy. But 15 years ago when we're younger, like, she's beautiful. She's out of my league. She's fun. You would have looked at her and said, why would you ever need anything else? Well, that's the whole thing. It's not a need. It's an unhealthy, addictive behavior that has nothing to do with the attractiveness, sexual availability, whatever, of your spouse. And so
that's good.
Again, to that betrayed spouse, this is not your fault, but unfortunately it has now become your story.
Yeah.
And you will have to deal with the trauma and the pain and the hurt of it. But if you can enter into it with that belief, this isn't my fault. I didn't do this. They did this to me. Then you'll actually, I think, be able to enter into a healing process where you can see areas, because we all, any one of us does have areas we need to grow. Sure, we could all find areas we could become a better spouse. I just want to keep anyone from thinking, if I was only a good enough spouse, this wouldn't have happened. Because I think just like the enemy tries to tell the struggler, you're uniquely bad, I think the enemy tries to tell the spouse, you are also uniquely bad. If you were only better, this wouldn't have happened. And that is just not true. So yes, deal with the pain. Yes, deal with the betrayal. Figure out, what does a new relationship with healthy structure and boundaries look like? But release yourself from that burden that thinks somehow I could have prevented this, or if for some reason I caused this. Because if you can get that piece at the beginning, you'll be on a much healthier journey from the get-go.
What occurs to me after a conversation like this is that if someone is looking to make a big change, it can't just be some form of behavior modification. One doesn't just wake up one day and decide to stop a pornography addiction. It must be a serious heart change, and that doesn't happen without Jesus. And that's just step one. True healing for the addict and the spouse is a long game. If any of this is resonating with you, consider that the Holy Spirit might be using this episode to speak to you. If you have tried and tried to quit, but it's just not working, start by talking to God. Ask Him to walk with you, and ask Him to show you someone that you can reach out to. Coming up next time, the final episode of this series. I sat down with Mike and Aaron together to see how they are doing right now.
That in the middle of my pain, God was right there, and He was loving me by loving Mike. And He was bringing Mike what he needed, which made me feel safe.
They are committed to doing the work that is required to find healing for all they have been through.
What I noticed was the more people I told, the easier it got to tell the story, and almost more power that I felt over my prior addiction.
I have several links in the show notes for anyone looking for help dealing with this issue. My email address is also there if you have any comments or questions about this episode or series. Thank you so much for listening today, and I will catch you here next time in the Nook.
The Nook Podcast is a production of Sozo Digital Media.